Live, I'm Kimberly Brooks. Thanks so much for joining us. After devastating the Bahamas, Hurricane Dorian is making its way to the Carolinas. Plus, Walmart is making some major gun moves after this latest mass shooting. And we check in on the U.S. Open and some tennis icons. But first, here are your headlines.
This morning, the head of the nation's largest retailer addressing gun violence head on. Walmart CEO Doug McMillon writing in a letter to employees, "It's clear to us that the status quo is unacceptable," promising the company will discontinue sales of short barrel rifle ammunition, discontinue sales of handgun ammunition, and discontinue handgun sales in Alaska, the last state where Walmart currently sells them. The move comes amid a surge in mass shootings in America, including this weekend when 7 people were killed by a shooter in Texas. Many anti-gun activists applauding the move, but the NRA called it shameful to see Walmart succumb to the pressure of anti-gun elites. The Walmart CEO himself, a gun owner, encouraging the president and Congress to take action. Legislation to close loopholes on all gun sales was passed by the House in February, but has been stalled in the Senate.
Chief Executive Carrie Lam has formally withdrawn the controversial extradition legislation that touched off months of pro-democracy protests in that city. That, according to the New York Times. This morning, a police spokesman in Hong Kong announcing police fired non-lethal weapons at protesters during the latest demonstrations. The bill would have allowed Hong Kong to hand over criminal suspects to the mainland for trial and has sparked protests since early June, with hundreds of protests and some clashes with riot police.
A new twist in the college admissions bribery scandal. 2 parents charged in the scandal now claim the University of Southern California has a regular practice of considering donations before deciding which students to accept. Newly revealed school documents allegedly name certain students and their families potential to make big donations to the university.
I'm happy you guys are with us today because we begin with our full on-the-ground storm coverage with updated information if you are, in fact, in the path of Hurricane Dorian. Very destructive, and after devastating the Bahamas, it was sitting on the island for over 48 hours. It's slowly pulling away now and moving toward the U.S. So I'm joined by our ABC meteorologist, Greg Dutra, for the latest storm track. Good to see you.
Good to see you this morning. Could you imagine being in the eye wall for 48 hours?
Absolutely not.
It's crazy.
You know, what's crazy to me is that I remember when we were talking about this storm when it first started, you know, the focus was on Puerto Rico.
Right.
And I feel like the Bahamas being devastated so badly is sort of a surprise.
A little bit of one, yeah, especially with that track. You're right, early, Puerto Rico is pretty firmly in the cone. We were very worried, especially recovering from what we're still recovering from there. And then it took that little swerve a bit off to the east, kind of did the end around Puerto Rico, and then the Bahamas came right under the gun for this, and it's still a very strong hurricane. Even though it's not a Category 5 anymore, there's still a lot of concerns.
And so now I think everyone's wondering what the latest storm track is, which you can tell us.
And it has gone down, downgraded to a Category 2. That happened yesterday. But again, we can't let our guards down just because the winds are down, because this is raking the coast, moving up towards Amelia Island. Not going to make landfall, don't get me wrong, near Amelia Island in Florida, but crossing the border here from Florida to Georgia. Florida kind of breathing a sigh of relief. We'll get to that in just a couple of seconds, but this does remain a Category 2. And look at this latest track. There's a possibility of Dorian making landfall out near the Outer Banks as you head up into North Carolina. Here are those winds. Again, Florida breathing a little bit of a sigh of relief as those winds are still around or even above tropical storm force. Look at Daytona Beach at 43 miles per hour, and very heavy rains are lashing the coast of Florida, but they're bands of rainfall here. You're not seeing that sustained stuff like we saw over Grand Bahama Island. Now, this is where we do start to get worried. And as you're moving up towards South and North Carolina, look at these winds. This is Thursday. Wednesday into Thursday is when Dorian really sets its sights on the mid-Atlantic. 69-mile-per-hour winds in Charleston. That's near hurricane strength. And those winds even stay near hurricane strength as Dorian moves off to the north and east and up the eastern seaboard Thursday and into Friday. And there is that possibility, according to this weather model, that it does make landfall somewhere near the Outer Banks. And with storm surges anywhere from 4 to 7 feet, rainfall on top of that from 6 to 10 inches, we could be talking about some serious coastal flooding, Kimberly.
Yeah, Greg, and he mentioned yesterday how the damage in the Bahamas was so bad that the islands will look different on maps going forward. So remember, it was a Category 5 when it made landfall there, with at least 7 deaths reported. And now with it moving on, the main priority is rescuing the survivors. So our Marcus Moore has been on the ground there and is in Nassau with the latest. Marcus?
Oh, Kimberly, good morning. This is a dire situation unfolding on the Abaco Islands right now, and there are areas that first responders still have not been able to reach in their search for survivors. That's how bad the damage is and how much difficulty they're having in traversing some of the areas, because much of the islands there are underwater. They were so concerned about that storm surge, and it was as high as 15 feet in certain areas. So the work to go and search for survivors, that is just getting underway. In fact, we were with a police officer as we walked through the destruction, and he was going to several of the homes, searching the damage to see if there was anyone there who perhaps was injured and survived, or may have passed away. And the fear here is it's almost certain that the death toll will rise as a result of Hurricane Dorian. And something else that we are seeing is a humanitarian crisis that is unfolding. There are thousands of people on the Abaco Island that have nowhere to go. Their homes have been destroyed. And when we went to the medical clinic, it was an astonishing scene. There were hundreds of people filling the hallways on either side, lining those halls, men, women, and children, these families, just sitting there, waiting to see what they will do next. And in the midst of all of that, a medical team is trying to treat the injured in another wing, but they said that it's been overrun by survivors. And so it gives you a sense of the dire nature of what's happening there. And we've also seen the Coast Guard flying or airlifting the most seriously injured patients to hospitals where they can receive treatment. And there's one image where we saw a guy who had a head injury. His head was bandaged, and he seemed dazed and just in shock by what he was seeing. It seemed as if for the first time he was able to get a bird's eye view of what was left of this island, and there's not much. It is a terribly sad scene on the islands, and we have now seen firsthand how long of a road to recovery they will have there. Kimberly.
Thank you, Marcus. Unbelievably devastating. We want to bring you another part of the story. Marcus and his team were interviewing a man from their hotel that was swept away in the floodwaters earlier. So take a listen to this.
And the water, you said, took you all the way to this?
I mean, I just came like in a path, because it's like a raging river. I just came from over there, like literally, like through all this debris. That's why I know it's scratched up. And I came through here, and I held onto that blue car, but I couldn't like hold onto it. That's how strong the water was. And all I could think about, if I get washed to sea, I was going to be in big trouble. So thank God I made it down by that couch right there, and came down, and somebody had a van right here.
That's our van.
With a back window down. And I said, praise the Lord. So I reached in, and it was unlocked. And I got in and sat in the back seat and drank somebody's water. I don't know whose water it was.
It was probably my water or part of our crew.
Yeah, and I've been sitting there for like the last 2 hours, waiting for someone to appear. And that's it.
Oh my goodness. Man, I'm glad to see you.
I'm glad to see you. I didn't think it could happen to me, you know what I mean? Because you're in the denial a little bit. Like, oh, my house is strong. It's been through like 6, 7 hurricanes, and poof.
There's no words, right? So as you can imagine, there is a desperate need for food and water on this island. We cannot stress that enough. And so here's a list of organizations and websites you can go to that will have ways you can help to donate to help the people of the Bahamas who need it so much right now. So take a look at those. And Greg, as you mentioned earlier, you know, it's not going to make landfall in Florida. It's making its way to the Carolinas as a Category 2, but a Category 2 still is dangerous.
It is, and it still doesn't have to make landfall to bring significant dangers, too. Even if it does happen to stay off of the shore, which is where the track officially is now, although dangerously close to the Outer Banks, there's still going to be a lot of flooding. 4 to 7 feet of storm surge, waves on top of that, and then possibly up to 15 inches of rain in the low country of South Carolina. I know Charleston has problems with just severe thunderstorms. Only 20 feet above sea level. I think we're going to see some pretty serious flooding out of there through the next couple of days.
Yeah, well, the effects can certainly still be felt from the coast in Florida with strong winds and rain. So I want to go to Rob Marciano, who's in Sebastian, Florida. Rob, good to see you. You know, Florida cannot breathe a sigh of relief just yet, right?
Oh, certainly not northern Florida. Kimberly, good morning to you. But this part of the Central Coast, the East Coast, the Space Coast, the Treasure Coast, as it's called, could have been a lot worse. If the storm itself stayed about 100 miles offshore, the forecast was for it to be between 60 and 80 miles. So that 20 to 40 mile push to the east really made all the difference in the world. In our location, we had winds that didn't gust more than 65 miles an hour. We had a measured gust at 63 miles per hour. Power went out here for about an hour and then came back on a short time later. And for this county, less than 1% of people were without power. So that part of it certainly could have been a lot worse. We've seen utility crews, nonetheless, being fanned out to repair some of the damage to some of the poles, to some of the trees that have been laid down because of that. But the winds, at least now, have lightened a little bit. We're a little bit protected. Yesterday at this time, they were coming onshore, and obviously that would push the water onshore with that 4 to 7 foot surge. Now they're pushing the water offshore, unless, of course, you're on the other side of the barrier island. On the east coast of those bays and rivers, it's pretty rough, and there's some water rise there. But it's a different scene here, and I'll show you what's going on. People now are starting to come out. The evacuation orders have been lifted, and the surfers have come out as well. When you have that offshore wind, surfers love that. It holds the waves up. It lays down the water. But we still obviously have a big swell from what is a Category 2 hurricane just off toward our north and east. Government offices are closed again today. They do say that they are closing schools tomorrow. We'll see if that holds because people are starting to get out and about and start to unboard, if you will, and take the shutters off some of their shops. But certainly could be a lot worse here. The problem now is, and Greg probably pointed this out, it's over the Gulf Stream. I'm seeing a little bit more convection around the center, and as it heads north, generally speaking, the wind field begins to expand. So now the reach of this storm west towards the coastlines of Daytona, Jacksonville, Savannah, Georgia, and eventually Charleston, which certainly is vulnerable, it's going to be increasing. So I think we'll see more actually in the way of a surge and more as a way of wind impacts over the next 36 to really 72 hours as this thing makes its way up the coast.
And Rob, and Rob, before we go, are the airports reopening along the Florida coastline?
Generally speaking, from south to north, they are reopening. PBI West Palm Beach is opening. Orlando set to open at noon today, and any of the airports that are a little bit closer to the coastline, obviously farther north, they'll be slower to open up as well. But you got to remember, if you are flying in and out or have friends or family that are trying to travel, all the flights that were canceled the last couple of days, now that bottle up, they're all jammed up. So those seats are going to be taken, and more flights are going to be affected, kind of a ripple effect. So it's going to take folks a while to get in and out of here, and for those airlines, even though the airports are slowly opening, for their schedules to get back on track. Such is life in the hurricane zone. And this one, even though it's getting less of a factor right here, is far from over as far as the rest of the Southeast is concerned. Kimberly?
All right, Rob Marciano right there in Sebastian, Florida. Thank you so much for the updates. We appreciate it. And guys, so as Greg said, what is the next stop for this dangerous storm? We said the Carolinas. So there's life-threatening storm surge. That's a major concern, and lots of mandatory evacuations have been issued. So Steve Osunsami is in Charleston, South Carolina with the latest. Steve?
We are standing directly in front of the seawall at the corner of East Bay and Water Street. This is an area that often floods, and the city is warning residents who are staying, and there are many of them, to get off the roads. They want them off the roads by this evening because they're concerned about flooding. And they point out during last year's big storm, they had to rescue 40 people from flooded vehicles, and they're trying not to have to do that again. To give you a sense of what Charleston is up against, where I'm standing right now, we have pictures from 2017. It was Irma, which was just a tropical storm, and in those pictures you can see the water pouring over the seawall. A good part of this area was underwater. They don't call this Water Street for nothing. And in the past 4 years, some residents here have flooded 4 times. Charleston can flood in a regular rain, so they are highly concerned about this happening with a hurricane nearby. Hospital CEOs are doing their best to move patients to other facilities, we're being told this morning. One hospital has been moving patients to as far as Columbia and Greenville, hours away, and their plan is to get their patients moved and their people off the roads by this morning, well before the first tropical storm force winds arrive.
All right, Steve, thank you so much. And guys, of course, we're going to be updating you all day on the latest storm track, so you can stay tuned to ABC News Live for everything. And now we move on to other news. Major changes at mega super chain Walmart after a spate of mass shootings this weekend in Odessa, Texas, and 2 that happened within 2 hours of each other. If you remember, Dayton, Ohio, and El Paso, Texas. Walmart has decided to limit the sales of guns and ammunition, with the CEO making an announcement in a memo yesterday. So I want to bring in Catherine Falders in our D.C. bureau with more details. Catherine, it's good to see you. What did the CEO cite as his reason for this decision?
Yeah, so he wrote a letter to employees yesterday, and he's saying in his letter, it's clear to us that the status quo is unacceptable, is what he wrote to all of his employees. Of course, this comes in the wake of all of those shootings that you mentioned, and it's not just discontinuing the sales of ammunition, as you mentioned. It's also gun sales, handgun sales, for example, in Alaska, the only state where Walmart currently sells them. But I think it's also important to point out in his letter, the CEO is a gun owner himself. He's encouraging in this letter the president and Congress to take action on this issue, Kimberly.
Yeah, so we just have to, make note of this. This is the biggest retail store in the U.S. pooling guns. Does this put any pressure on Congress to respond?
Yeah, it's a significant move, and I think it has put some pressure on Congress. You've seen some Democrats obviously come out in support of his statement, of his letter to employees, and I think that's coupled with the fact that Democrats also are encouraging Republicans in the White House to act on this legislation. As you know, Republicans aren't particularly happy with the move, and neither is the NRA, but in the wake of these shootings that have all happened, by the way, while Congress has been on a 5 to 6 week recess, is surely putting pressure on them when they come back next week to do something about this.
So obviously a controversial move to some. The NRA put out a statement, I believe.
Yeah, they did. They're saying it's, quote, shameful to see Walmart succumb to pressure of anti-gun elites. Clearly not happy about the move. And also keep in mind that the president of the NRA over the course of this recess with Congress and in the wake of these shootings has also been having multiple conversations with the president as the administration and as Congress decides what next steps to take here.
All right, Catherine Falders with the updates there in our D.C. bureau. Thank you so much. We appreciate it. And guys, we move on to that incredible tragedy in Southern California. A recreational scuba diving trip turned deadly when the boat caught fire. So I want to bring in Will Carr, who's on the ground with the latest details. Will, it's good to see you. What do we know about the search and rescue mission at this point?
Well, Kimberly, to give you an understanding, this is the first morning that we have seen all of the Coast Guard boats here at the Coast Guard headquarters in Oxnard. That's because before this, they were out working around the clock, hoping that they could find some survivors from this boat fire. But at this point, they have switched that search for survivors into a recovery operation. They now believe that the 34 passengers who were below deck on that charter boat all died. They've recovered at least 20 bodies at this point, but the ship actually sank. It's flipped upside down on the bottom of the Pacific Ocean right now, and they are still trying to recover many of the remains. Kimberly.
Will, this is, I mean, it's absolutely devastating. I think the question everyone has is, how did this happen?
That is the big question right now. They want to know exactly what sparked this fire. If you'll remember, there were 5 crew members who were on the top deck who were able to jump off the boat, and they were rescued by another nearby boat. Authorities have been interviewing them. That process will continue throughout the course of the day. Some of the things they want to know from those crew members is, were they awake or were they asleep when the fire broke out? What exactly were they doing when those first flames broke out, and what they did, if anything, if they could have potentially helped those passengers. But at this point, authorities say they really believe that the 34 passengers below pretty much had no chance of survival because of how quickly that fire spread. Kimberly.
You were actually on one of the boats. What was that experience like, seeing what these people would have been going through?
That's right. We were on a very similar charter. We went down below to the bunk room. It is tight quarters down there. You have bunks upon bunks, not a whole lot of room just for sleeping. Getting by was kind of like a single file type walking in and out. And they did have an escape hatch, and it had a stairwell that went down. So you have 2 potential ways to get out. It's my understanding that the boat, the Conception that we're talking about, was very similar in that regard, that it had a stairwell and the escape hatch. But at this point, authorities say the fire spread so quickly along the top deck. We also learned they believe the fire started on the 2nd level, which would be right above where those 34 people, those 34 passengers were sleeping. They just don't think that there was any opportunity to either race up that stairwell or get out of that escape hatch. And again, they just don't think they really had a chance. Kimberly.
Incredibly sad. Will Carr right there in Oxnard, California. Thank you so much. And we move over to the UK, where Parliament is set to extend the Brexit deadline, showing resistance toward Prime Minister Boris Johnson. And per usual, things get heated in these sessions. While Johnson was talking, Philip Lee of the Conservative Party crossed over to sit with the Liberal Party. So take a look at this.
Barriers. Yeah. Britain is on the verge, Mr. Speaker, and restoring our independent seat in the WTO for the first time.
Pretty remarkable, in fact. So I want to bring in James Longman in our London bureau. James, that was a bold move. Real talk. What is going on over there? Please break this down.
Well, Kimberly, as ever, it's all about Brexit. This country's efforts to leave the European Union. There was a referendum in 2016, and it basically sent a torpedo into our political system. And what we're watching now really is the fallout of that. I'd say, tensions have been simmering over the last 3 years, but really they're breaking out over into above the surface, and a lot of people are getting damaged. And that's what's happened here. You've seen Philip Lee in the middle of Boris Johnson's speech, trying to plead with his fellow MPs, other lawmakers, to not take control of the Brexit process from him. As he's doing that, a member of his own party stands up, crosses the floor and sits down with the opposition. It is quite extraordinary, but he wasn't alone. 21 other members of Boris Johnson's own party decided to rebel against the government. They didn't join another party, but they've now been basically fired from the Conservative Party. They're still sitting MPs. They're still elected to represent their constituents, but they don't do it on behalf of the Conservative Party anymore. And just to give you an idea how cataclysmic that is, we're talking about former Chancellors of the Exchequer, Treasury Secretaries in your language. We're talking about the grandson of Winston Churchill, possibly this country's most famous ever Conservative Prime Minister. He's now been told he's not Conservative enough for the Conservative Party. So really, Brexit has ripped up the rule book here. It has sent this country really into a spiral. And just to give you a sense, today there was a really rather funny tweet I read. Mike Pence, the Vice President, is in this country, and someone tweeted today, "I've just realised Mike Pence arrives in London tonight like when you forgot you have guests and your boiler is broken and the pipes have burst and the house is also on fire." That is the sense really in this country. Politics is upside down.
Oh, my goodness. So maybe it's just me. I mean, this whole situation has been a bit hard to follow, but what's happening going forward? What happens next from here?
Well, your guess is as good as mine, Kimberly. I can tell you what's happened so far. Yesterday, Parliament voted to take control from the government. So today, MPs are probably going to pass a law which would basically outlaw no-deal Brexit. That's leaving the European Union without an agreement with Brussels. Now, people don't want there to be a no-deal Brexit because they worry that that could crash the UK economy, it could slash house prices, it could mean millions of people lose their jobs. And there are enough MPs in Parliament at the moment, because Boris Johnson has now lost his majority as the governing Prime Minister, to make sure that a no deal happens. But after that, what happens next? Because you haven't got a government with enough MPs to run the country. And so could we face a general election? That's looking very, very likely. But will it solve Brexit? Unlikely. Kimberly?
All right, James Longman in our London bureau breaking it down. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Good to see you. And guys, did any of you get a chance to watch the U.S. Open last night? There were some highs and some lows for the tennis greats. So I want to bring in ESPN's Darren Cahill with the latest. Darren, let's just start with Roger Federer. A shocking loss there, right?
Yeah, it was surprising because he had such a great head-to-head record against Grigor 7-0 going into this one. But it was a different Grigor Dimitrov than what Federer has seen previously. A more aggressive Grigor, held tight to the baseline. He hit his backhand as hard as I've ever seen him. Didn't quite get the yips on the serves, which he sometimes can get. And he had big belief against Federer. So this was really about how well Grigor Dimitrov played. Roger struggled a little bit with the back injury that he struggled with the last few years from the fourth set onwards. But it was really no excuse because Grigor was good enough to stay with Roger and then opened up a good lead early in the fifth set. So it was a wonderful night for Grigor through to his semi-finals of the US Open. And it's been a tough year for Grigor as well. So in the locker room, that was a pretty popular win.
Yeah, and so then let's just move to Serena, who in the complete opposite way completely crushed her opponent in 44 minutes total. What do we think of that?
Yeah, she took on Wang Xiang, who last year, this time to the end of the year, was maybe the best performing WTA player. So she's an incredibly good player, top 20 in the world. And Serena made it look average yesterday. It was an amazing performance by Serena. It's been kind of that way since the opening round when she played Sharapova in the first round. And she's continued to get better as the tournament has come along. You would expect she would get to the final, but there's still some really good players in her section. She's up against Svitolina next. Svitolina's been top 5 for the last 3 or 4 years, so that will be a tough one. But the good thing for Serena is if she does make it through to the final, no one left in the draw has ever even been to a major final. So psychologically, she'll have a big advantage there. If she plays her best tennis, very difficult to pick against Serena, and she's playing her best tennis at the moment.
All right, Darren Cahill right there in Queens, New York for us. Thank you so much. Good to see you with the updates. And guys, I hope everyone is celebrating a national holiday today. Yes, it's Beyonce's birthday. And Beyonce, if you're watching, happy birthday from all of us. So what would Beyonce do? She would take care of herself today. And I hope you guys continue to take care of yourselves. And if you're around, you can stick around for the briefing room at 3:30 p.m. Then you can check out World News Prime at 8 p.m. And if you want to stay updated on all of these headlines and the hurricane coverage, you can go to abcnews.com or download the app. I'm Kimberly Brooks, and I'll see you later.